Blood was the last thing Harlan expected to smell on his wedding day. He'd ordered a wife from a catalog out of Chicago, expecting calico and quiet companionship. Instead, he found her half buried under a rotting pine, lungs rattling like dry leaves. He'd been waiting 3 months. Frost coated the coarse hairs of the mule's ears, turning them into stiff, white spikes. Harlan shifted in the saddle, the frozen leather groaning beneath his weight. It was a sound he usually ignored, but today it grated against his nerves, sharp as a rusted saw blade. He dragged a thick, calloused hand down his face, feeling the grit of 3 days' hard riding ground into his beard. His knuckles were cracked, weeping thin lines of blood that dried black in the biting wind. He was a fool. That was the only conclusion that made any sense. A 30-year-old fool who had sent $50 in hard-earned gold dust to a proxy agency in Chicago, asking for a woman willing to live at 9,000 feet. He had built a second chair for the cabin. He had whittled a new handle for the butter churn. For 3 months, he had gone down to the valley every other week, standing at the edge of the mercantile, watching the stagecoach arrive, spit out prospectors and drummers, and leave empty. Now, the sky above the Bitterroots was the color of a bruised iron skillet, heavy and low, with the promise of the first real blizzard. Winter didn't announce itself up here. It just slammed the door shut and trapped whatever was left inside. Harlan spat a stream of dark tobacco juice into the snowpack beside the trail. "Hiya," he grunted, digging his heels into the mule's ribs. The beast snorted, a wet, rattling sound, and picked its way down the final rocky switchback toward the abandoned relay station at Miller's Crossing. This was the last place the stage driver claimed he'd left a passenger 2 weeks ago. Harlan had tracked down the driver in a saloon in town, pinning the man's sleeve to the bar until he stammered out the truth. "Left her at Miller's. She said someone was comin'. We was running late. Apaches spotted south of the ridge. Ain't my fault if your mail-order bride got cold feet." Miller's Crossing wasn't a town. It wasn't even a proper settlement. It was a rotting timber shack with a collapsed roof and a corral made of splintered pine poles, reeking of old ash and coyote urine. As Harlan rode into the small clearing, the silence pressed in on him, heavy and absolute. The wind died for a brief second, and in that vacuum, the complete lack of human life was deafening. He dismounted, his boots crunching loudly through the crust of snow. He tied the mule to the remains of a hitching post. He didn't draw his repeater from the saddle scabbard. If there were outlaws or natives around, they were long gone. The cold had a way of sanitizing the landscape, freezing out any lingering warmth. Harlan walked toward the shack. The door hung off a single rusted leather hinge. He nudged it open with his boot. It fell inward with a loud crack, kicking up a cloud of stale, freezing dust. Nothing inside but rat droppings and the skeletal remains of a pack rat's nest. He stepped back out, his jaw tight. He felt a hot, familiar spike of anger in his chest. Not at her, at himself. She had probably taken one look at the sheer, brutal face of the mountain, realized what kind of life awaited her, and paid the next stage going east to take her back to civilization. It was the smart thing to do. Harlan couldn't even blame her. He turned to leave, ready to make the long, bitter climb back to his solitary claim, when something caught his eye. Over by the tree line, about 50 yards past the collapsed corral, a splash of unnatural color against the relentless gray and white of the timber. Harlan frowned, his hand instinctively dropping to the heavy iron of the Colt on his hip. He moved slowly, his boots breaking the snow with rhythmic, deliberate crunches. As he got closer, the shape resolved into a steamer trunk. The canvas covering was slashed, the brass clasps beaten in with a rock. Clothing thin, useless cotton dresses, a pair of woolen stockings, a crushed bonnet lay scattered around it, half buried in the snow and stiff with ice. He crouched beside the trunk, pulling off his right glove with his teeth. He ran his bare fingers over the slashed canvas. The edges were stiff, frozen solid. This hadn't happened today, or even yesterday. Then, he smelled it. Underneath the sharp tang of pine needles and ozone, there was the heavy, sweet, sour stench of human sickness, unwashed skin, old sweat, and something metallic. Blood. Harlan stood up slowly. His eyes scanned the tree line. The snow here was disrupted, A drag mark, mostly filled in by the recent flurries, led away from the trunk and into the dense cluster of deadfall pines. He didn't run. Running was a good way to twist an ankle or catch a bullet. He walked, tracking the faint disturbance in the snow. The smell grew stronger, mixed now with the unmistakable odor of voided bowels and impending death. Underneath the root ball of a massive, overturned Douglas fir, a hollow had been scraped out. It was a desperate, pathetic attempt at a den. Harlan stopped, his breath plumed in the freezing air. She was in there. She wasn't wearing a clean calico dress. She was wrapped in a filthy, mud-caked wool coat that was 3 sizes too big, probably scavenged from the stagecoach. Her knees were pulled up tight to her chest, her face buried in the collar. She was so still that for a long, agonizing moment, Harlan was certain he had come all this way just to bury a stranger. "Hey," Harlan said. His voice was a harsh, gravelly scrape in the quiet woods. She didn't move. Harlan cursed softly under his breath. He stepped into the hollow, his boots sinking into the soft, rotting earth beneath the snow. He reached down and grabbed the shoulder of the oversized coat, intending to pull her out into the light. The moment his hand closed on the fabric, she convulsed. It wasn't a romantic awakening. It was a violent, spastic shudder. A low, wet hacking sound tore from her throat, and she rolled onto her back, her face finally visible in the dim light filtering through the pine boughs. Harlan felt his stomach drop. Her skin was the color of old tallow, stretched so tight over her cheekbones he could see the exact shape of her skull. Her lips were cracked and tinged with a horrifying shade of blue. A dark, ugly bruise covered the left side of her jaw, turning the surrounding flesh a sickly yellow-green. Her eyes opened, but they didn't see him. They were glassy, rolling lazily in their sockets, completely unmoored from reality. "Been waitin'," she mumbled, her voice nothing more than a dry rasp. A bubble of bloody saliva formed at the corner of her mouth and popped. Harlan stared down at her. He didn't feel a surge of heroic purpose. He didn't feel love at first sight. He felt a deep, profound exhaustion settle into his marrow. He had spent 3 months waiting for a partner to share the load. Instead, the brutal world had just dumped a dying woman at his feet. "Damn it all," Harlan whispered, the words slipping out as a ragged breath. He didn't want this. He didn't want the responsibility of watching a woman die, of digging a grave in frozen soil, of carrying the ghost of her around his cabin for the rest of his miserable life. The practical, hardened part of his brain, the part that had kept him alive in the high country for 10 years, screamed at him to walk away. She was too far gone. Pneumonia had deep hooks in her chest. He could hear it in the wet, sucking sound of her breathing. To try and move her would likely kill her faster. To stay here meant risking getting trapped by the incoming storm. But his boots remained planted in the mud. He dropped to his knees, ignoring the icy slush seeping through his denim trousers. He reached out, his thick fingers hesitating before pressing against the side of her neck. Her skin was terrifyingly hot, a dry, papery burning that felt entirely wrong against the freezing air. Her pulse was a frantic, erratic flutter against his thumb, like a dying bird trapped against a window pane. "What's your name?" he asked, not because he expected an answer, but because the silence of the woods felt too heavy. The letter said Cora. "You, Cora?" She shivered, a violent, full-body tremor that rattled her teeth. She squeezed her eyes shut, turning her head away from him, burying her bruised face back into the collar of the filthy coat. "Don't, please. Took the money. Just go." Delirium. She was reliving whatever nightmare had left her stranded here. The stage driver hadn't just dropped her off. Someone had waited. Someone had robbed her trunk, struck her down, and left her to the elements. The realization didn't spark a fiery need for vengeance in Harlan. It just confirmed his cynical view of the world. Men were bastards. Gravity pulled things down. The cold killed. These were just facts. "Nobody's taking anything else from you," Harlan grunted. He had to get a fire going, just to thaw her out enough to move her. He stood up, his joints popping, and began kicking violently at the dead branches of the fallen fir, snapping off dry limbs. He gathered a handful of dry pine needles from deep within the root ball, his movements jerky, fueled by a sudden, unwanted surge of adrenaline. He struck a match against his boot heel. The wind snuffed it instantly. Son of a bitch, he snarled. He struck another, cupping his heavy hands around the frail flame, his broad shoulders hunched against the wind. The pine needles caught, sending up a thin, fragrant ribbon of gray smoke. He fed it twigs, then larger branches, until a modest fire cracked and hissed in the hollow. The heat did little against the vastness of the cold, but it illuminated Cora's face. The harsh orange light highlighted the dark hollows under her eyes and the crust of dried blood beneath her nose. She looked like a corpse someone had propped up for a photograph. Harlan pulled his heavy bearskin coat off his shoulders. The sudden loss of insulation hit him like a physical blow. The biting cold immediately began sinking its teeth into his flannel shirt. He shuddered, biting back a curse, and roughly draped the massive, foul-smelling hide over her trembling body. "Drink," he ordered, uncorking his canteen and kneeling beside her again. He shoved his arm under her shoulders, lifting her up. She was dead weight, her head lolling sickeningly on her neck. She smelled strongly of fever, sweat, and stale vomit. Harlan felt a flash of disgust, immediately followed by a wave of guilt. He pressed the metal rim of the canteen to her cracked lips. Water spilled, running down her chin and soaking into her collar. She gagged, choking on the liquid, and her eyes shot open. This time, they focused on him, just for a second. She looked at his massive, bearded face, the scars cutting through his left eyebrow, the sheer, intimidating bulk of him holding her up. Panic flared in her cloudy eyes. She weakly brought her hands up, pushing against his chest. It was like a child trying to push over an anvil. "No," she wheezed. "Stop fighting, woman," Harlan snapped, his voice harsher than he intended. "I ain't gonna hurt you. I'm Harlan. Harlan Mercer. I sent the letter." The name didn't seem to register. Her eyes rolled back again, and she slumped against his arm, completely unconscious. Harlan let out a long, slow breath, watching the frost form from his exhale. He looked up at the sky. The bruising gray had darkened to charcoal. The first few flakes of snow were beginning to fall, fat and heavy, sticking to the sleeves of his shirt. He couldn't stay here. The fire wouldn't be enough to keep her alive through the night, and if it dumped 2 feet of snow, the mule wouldn't be able to make the climb tomorrow. It was now or never. "All right, Cora," he muttered, bracing his boots in the mud. "This ain't gonna be pretty." He reached under her knees and behind her back. He hoisted her up. She wasn't light. She was dead weight, clumsy and uncooperative. Her broken collarbone, he assumed it was broken, by the way her shoulder hung at an unnatural angle, must have sent a jolt of agony through her, because she let out a high, thin wail that made the hair on the back of Harlan's neck stand up. He ignored it, marching toward the mule. The animal sidestepped nervously at the smell of blood and sickness, snorting and shaking its head. "Hold still, you ugly bastard," Harlan growled at the mule. Getting her into the saddle was a nightmare of awkward limbs and sliding fabric. He practically threw her over the pommel, her stomach resting against the horn. He swung himself up behind her, the leather groaning in protest. There was no room. He had to pull her back against his chest, wrapping his left arm securely around her waist to keep her from sliding off, while his right hand took the reins. Her head fell back against his shoulder. Her hair, greasy and stiff with dirt, rubbed against his jaw. He could feel the prominent ridges of her ribs through the heavy layers of clothing, knocking weakly against his sternum with every breath she took. She was terrifyingly fragile. "Haya," Harlan commanded, kicking the mule. The beast lurched forward, beginning the grueling, steep ascent back up the mountain. With every step, Cora's body ground against his. The saddle horn dug into his thigh. His unprotected back was exposed to the biting, increasing snowfall. He looked down at the pale, bruised face resting against his collarbone. He had wanted a partner to make the quiet nights less deafening. Now, he had a broken, dying woman bleeding on his only good shirt. "Don't die on me before we get to the top," Harlan said to the howling wind. "I ain't digging a grave in the dark." Snow fell not in flakes, but in hard, driving pellets that stung Harlan's face like rock salt. The wind had shifted, screaming down the canyon and stripping the last dead leaves from the scrub oak. Every step the mule took was a negotiation with gravity. The trail, barely wider than a wagon rut in summer, was quickly vanishing under the drifting white. Harlan's left arm, clamped around Cora's waist, had gone completely numb an hour ago. He couldn't feel his fingers, couldn't tell if he was gripping her wool coat or her actual flesh. He just held on, locking his shoulder joint into a rigid, painful bracket. She felt impossibly hot against his chest, radiating a fever heat that seeped through his flannel and long johns. It was a terrifying, consuming heat, the kind that cooked a brain in its own skull. Yet, her surface skin, where it brushed his neck, was ice. Every few minutes, a deep, rattling cough tore out of her, convulsing her entire frame. When she coughed, Harlan felt a sickening, grinding sensation against his forearm. A broken rib, maybe two, shifting under the skin. "Keep breathing," he rasped, his voice swallowed instantly by the howl of the wind. He wasn't praying. Harlan didn't believe in a god who handed out favors on mountaintops. He believed in momentum, friction, and sheer, stubborn spite. If she died up here, strapped to him on a freezing mule, it would be an insult to the 3 months of waiting. He refused to be insulted by the universe today. The mule stumbled. Its front left hoof hit a patch of blue ice hidden beneath the powder. The beast went down hard on its knees with a terrified squeal. Harlan jerked the reins instinctively, throwing his weight back to keep them from pitching over its neck. Cora's head snapped back, her skull cracking solidly against Harlan's jaw. He tasted copper instantly as his teeth clipped his tongue. He spat blood onto the mule's mane, cursing loudly, violently, strings of profanity that the wind tore away. "Up, you worthless nag! Up!" he roared, kicking his spurs into the animal's flanks. The mule scrambled, hooves scraping desperately against the hidden rock, and surged back to its feet, trembling violently. Harlan sucked in a harsh breath of freezing air, his jaw throbbing. He looked down at the woman. She hadn't even flinched when her head struck him. Her breathing was shallower now, a wet, irregular flutter. Dread, cold and heavy as lead, settled in his gut. They crested the final ridge an hour later, the cabin emerging from the whiteout like a dark, rotting tooth. It wasn't much to look at peeled pine logs, a sod roof heavy with snow, and a single small window covered in scraped rawhide. But to Harlan, it was a fortress. He didn't bother tying the mule. He threw his right leg over the saddle horn and slid to the ground, his knees nearly buckling as the blood rushed back into his frozen legs. He reached up, grabbed Cora by the heavy bearskin coat, and practically dragged her out of the saddle. He caught her before she hit the ground, throwing her over his shoulder like a sack of grain. He kicked the cabin door open. It slammed against the inside wall with a loud bang, revealing a single room locked in sub-zero darkness. The air inside was stale, smelling of cold wood ash, dried venison, and loneliness. Harlan dumped her unceremoniously onto the narrow bed in the corner. The mattress of stuffed pine boughs crunched loudly. He didn't pause to catch his breath. Survival in the high country was a checklist, and he was already behind. First, fire. He grabbed a handful of dry kindling from the iron bucket beside the stove, shoving it into the belly of the cast iron box. He struck a match, his clumsy, half-frozen fingers dropping the first two. The third caught. He blew gently until the wood shavings curled into flame, then threw on 3 split logs of seasoned birch. Next, the girl. He walked back to the bed. The dim light from the open stove door cast long, dancing shadows across the room. She lay exactly where he had dropped her, a crumpled pile of filthy wool and matted hair. "All right," he muttered, pulling his hunting knife from its sheath. "Let's see what they did to you." There was no room for modesty. Her clothes were a wet, freezing tomb. The oversized coat was stiff with ice and mud. Harlan didn't bother with the buttons. His fingers were too numb, and the fabric was ruined anyway. He slid the sharp edge of the blade under the collar and sliced downward, tearing the heavy wool apart. Underneath, she wore a tattered cotton dress, soaked through and clinging to her skin like a shroud. He cut that away too, peeling the freezing fabric back. The smell hit him instantly, a sour, awful stench of unwashed sickness and dried blood. When he finally stripped her down to her thin, soiled undergarments, he stopped, his breath catching in his throat. The proxy agency had sent him a photograph of a smiling, plump-cheeked woman in a high-collared blouse. The creature on his bed was a skeleton wrapped in bruised parchment. Her collarbone on the left side jutted up at a sharp, unnatural angle. The skin over it stretched taut and purple. A massive, yellowish-black bruise spanned the entire right side of her ribcage, the clear shape of a boot heel stamped into the mottled flesh. Someone hadn't just robbed her. They had tried to kick her to death. Her boots were next. The leather was frozen solid to her woolen stockings. Harlan had to cut the laces, carefully peeling the boots away. Her toes were a terrifying waxy white, the nails tinged blue. He grabbed a rough woolen blanket from his trunk and threw it over her trembling body, tucking it tight under her sides. He dragged a chair, the second chair, the one he had built specifically for her, to the side of the bed and collapsed into it. He sat there in the gloom, listening to the iron stove begin to tick and groan as it heated up, drowning out the howl of the blizzard outside. He stared at the pale, battered face resting on his goose-down pillow. He felt entirely out of his depth. He could track a bull elk through miles of dense timber. He could patch a roof. He could survive for weeks on pemmican and melted snow. But he had no idea how to fix a broken human being. Hours bled into a single, suffocating blur of boiling water and coughing fits. The cast-iron stove roared, turning the cabin into a stifling, humid box. Melted snow dripped from the sod roof, hissing sharply as it hit the hot iron plate. The overwhelming heat was intentional. Harlan needed to bake the frost out of her marrow, even if it meant suffocating himself in the process. He stripped off his own soaked shirt, sitting bare-chested in the stifling room, sweat pooling in the thick hair of his chest and dripping down his scarred ribs. Cora hadn't stopped thrashing since the cabin warmed. The heat seemed to supercharge the fever burning in her brain. She tossed her head from side to side, her greasy hair whipping against the pillow, mumbling in a rapid, frantic stream of nonsense. "Don't. The trunk is heavy. Arthur, please. The latches broke," she babbled, her cracked lips peeling and bleeding. She grabbed blindly at the rough wool blanket, her fingernails scraping desperately against the fabric. Took the gold. He took it. Harlan sat in the chair, a tin cup of boiling water steeping with crushed willow bark in his hands. The bitter, astringent smell filled the cramped room. He watched her, his jaw set in a hard, uncompromising line. Arthur. Whoever Arthur was, he was likely the bastard who left her bleeding in the snow. "Hold still," Harlan growled, leaning forward. He pinned her thrashing left arm to the mattress with his forearm, careful to avoid the massive bruise on her ribs. With his free hand, he brought the rim of the tin cup to her mouth. "Drink it," he ordered. She gagged at the smell, turning her face away, her eyes squeezed shut in the throes of delirium. "Poison. Smells like dirt." "It's willow bark. It'll kill the fever," he said, losing patience. He pinched her jaw gently, avoiding the purple swelling on her cheek, and forced her mouth open, tipping a small splash of the hot, bitter liquid past her teeth. She sputtered, coughing violently. Phlegm and brown liquid sprayed across Harlan's bare chest and arms. He didn't flinch. He didn't wipe it away. He just waited for the coughing fit to subside, the wet, tearing sound in her chest making him clench his teeth. When she finally stopped, gasping weakly for air, he forced another swallow down her throat. It was ugly, brutal work. There was no gentle mopping of a brow with a cool cloth. It was pinning her down, forcing hot liquids into her, and listening to her body fight a war with itself. He spent an hour cutting clean bandages from his remaining flour sacks, boiling them in a pot on the stove to wash the grim from